Good morning. As Peggy said, I'm Rodway Jung with Stantec Architecture. Been with them 17, 18 years now. We've been using Revit, I would say not since its infancy, but pretty much mainstream for the last 10 years I've been using it. And some of our further reaches have been using it down in the States or whatnot around, I'd say 15 years. So that's pretty close to infancy. So we're going to talk about BIM execution and planning for change. So I put together some learning objectives of what we're going to talk about today. I'm not going to talk to these points specifically. I'm just going to, when we go through some of the case studies, they'll hopefully realize themselves to you as you go through them and see how these learning objectives come to the surface as you're executing a plan and you realize that your plan isn't quite as solid as you thought it was, or someone's changed their mind or whatnot. So we're going to look like the strength of a BIM execution plan lies on its ability to flex and change. If you make a solid in-stone plan, and which can't change, it's not going to be an effective plan, especially on a large project. Smaller projects where you cookie cutter them and you recycle BIM execution plans from one project to the next, those do generally work, but when you have a larger project, it's 99% of the time not going to work. Stop allowing the software to drive the project. We've probably heard it all the time, that's the way Revit works. That's not the right answer. We've got to start looking for out-of-the-box solutions. How do we get around this problem? We can't just hit a roadblock because that's the way the software is built. Collaboration is the key to develop a sound plan and change. We've heard this already a few times today, collaboration, talking. Right? Don't work in silos, work as a team, work with everybody together. And keep your change manageable. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Depending on your team, your structure, your experience level, how much you've worked together, that will drive how much change you should be able to absorb into your plan. Okay, so we'll get right into it. BIM planning. So for those of us that have been involved with BIM planning in the past, we all have information that comes right from the start, right? You pull that information together, you read it, you understand it, you get together at a team, and then you start putting your plan together. Right? The first thing you want to think about when you start putting your plan together is align your planning with expectations. So you got the photo on the left, which some people might think goes together with a BIM plan or a BIM execution plan. However, that's not always the case. You don't need something that strategic or that complicated and involved if your end result is just the picture on the right. Right? You don't need to go through all of those steps to get something simple and make things overly complicated, overly cumbersome. We've seen an example earlier today in the P3 presentation when you were talking about the chair rails and the moldings. The first thing I thought is, why are you modeling that? However, it came to the surface, you needed it for heritage. And so it made sense. So that's an example where it did make sense. However, if you're just modeling for the sake of modeling it, it's not always the right solution. Putting together your plan, you've got all of your information, your standards. What does the owner want? What are you going to use BIM for? That one's key. What are you going to use it for? Not just you, but everybody in your team. Virtual coordination. Are you going to be using it? What kind of virtual coordination? Model protocols. Who's going to do what? Who's responsible for what? Deliverables. What's your end of the day deliverables? What's your interim deliverables? How are you going to put the project together and successfully deliver it at the end of the day? And again, back to the just because we can discussion. Is it a desk or a desk? Just because it looks nice in the model, looks great 3D, is there a reason to actually model it 3D? Are you going to be using it for visualization? No. So is the only person who's going to see that desk in 3D in the model, the person modeling itself? That's the wrong reason to model it. Right? That adds data to your file, it increases file size, it slows you down. If there's no valid reason, don't model it just because you can. moving through into the progression of a model. This is a bit of an alternate model progression timeline that you would see, where you're going to have a more involved, whether it be an IPD or a design build or a P3 style model, where you're going to have a lot of people involved. Who's involved at what phase? When are the models being started? When are the models being handed over? Are the models being handed over? How are you putting together everything at the end of the job to close it out? How are you going to turn it over to the owner? Does the owner want it? What does the owner want it for? What are they going to do with it? All of those questions need to get put together when you get your plan together and attempt to execute it on day one of project kickoff. And then at the end, planning for facility life cycle. Like I said, what is the owner going to use the model for? Are they requesting a model? Yes or no? Are they going to use it? What system are they going to use it with? Do they not know? Do they need some education on that sense? Those are a lot of questions, especially in this marketplace here, that we end up finding that we've seen a lot where people ask for a BIM model, and that's all they simply state. We want a BIM model or a Revit model, and they don't know what they're going to do with it when they get it. So those are all questions that need to come out to the surface right off the start in order for you to get that plan, as much information into it at the beginning. Because the more information you have up front, the better it is going to be for you to make that flexibility into your plan in order to execute it. So that was just a brief run through on execution or execution planning, things that we need to keep in mind when we're planning them. I'm quite sure a lot of you have gone through the process before, been involved either as a planner or from an owner side or as a consultant in these meetings. Everybody has a different way of doing it, and there is no set in stone way. But the key takeaway here is just make sure you have as much information as you can. Use everybody's experience from the past and try to bring as much of those questions to the surface so you can be ready for anything that comes down the road once you start getting into the execution. And so that's just a brief overview on that process. So we're going to get into a few case studies of how not having the right information or not knowing what was required at the time when we plan things, of how we need to get around these and start conducting or start implementing changes. How are we going to execute these plans? So we started with this quote, no plan of battle ever survives contact with the enemy. Right? That's an old military quote from years gone by. Basically says everything's great as you're planning, but as soon as you get to the execution mode, everything goes sideways, because that's when you start introducing the variables. What's going to change? So it lies on the back is the flexibility of every plan, right? That'll lead to the strength. That'll show you the strength of the plan of how flexible it is, because plans will change. Plans never get carried out without change occurring. So we'll get into our first project. We're going to talk about, this is the North Islands Hospital project. This was 2 facilities we built out in British Columbia on Vancouver Island. One in Campbell River, it was 35,000 square meters, 95 beds. One was 153 bed, 29,000 square meter hospital, $600 million, and it was completed and occupied in the spring of 2017. This is a P3 pursuit, 2 hospitals in one project. All right, so keys to remember, these are things we obviously knew from the start. We have 2 hospitals to deliver under one contract. They're 50 kilometers apart from each other. We needed to deliver 2 separate sets of drawings, which we knew from the start. But the one thing that threw us to the side was the contractor asked it for 1 set of details for both projects. They wanted a detail book that could be carried between both projects. So if you don't know where Comox and Comox Valley is on the south, on the eastern coast of Vancouver Island, Campbell River, 50 kilometers to the north. You can see Vancouver down here for some reference as to where they are. So how do we do this? What are the requirements? What are the risks? As soon as this change comes up, that's the first thing we try to break down. What is this change going to cost? So we have to look. So we need to require a requirement. We need to align the details on both projects. They need to be the same. The contractor wants the same exterior column plan detail for both projects along both sites. Seems simple enough. We need to look at the standardization of our teams. The way our teams were built when we were executing this plan was we had a team for one hospital and we had a completely separate team for another hospital. They were going to deliver those together. They were going to coordinate with the consultants. They were going to put the two separate sets of working drawings together as two separate independent projects. And then the referencing, that was the big deal. How do you get Revit to reference two separate projects into one separate other set of documents without combining absolutely everything into one project? I should have, before I started this is intended to be a bit more of a I guess, two-way dialogue session, I'm hoping. What I'm presenting here, none of this is the way to do things. There's 20 different ways to solve this project or solve this problem. So if you have any ideas, any questions, just interrupt me at any time, ask them. We'll talk about it. If you have, right at that point, don't wait till the end, because then we'll go back and try to relive these things, especially when I get through. I got a few more of these projects to talk about. So we don't want to go 3 projects before and try to remember what I was talking about, because it'll all probably run together by the end.
So then what was the purpose of the contractor wanting one set of details? Just for consistency and ease? Like,
It was for simplicity from their side, from the build team. From my understanding, we never did get a straight answer of why. What we were told, it was to make their build team simple, so they could understand the details from one site to the next. And so there was less questions. They said there would be less questions coming back to us on this detail because it'll be the same for both. We can answer it once. It's answered for both sites.
so both hospitals were being constructed concurrently?
Correct. Okay, so we'll get into the points here. So the alignment of both projects. So the same construction between the projects, and this kind of goes back to what we were just discussing. One of the problems we had, though, is it was the same contractor. It was 2 different sites, but the build teams were different. It was a different super on each site, obviously, and it's a different team managing the projects. There wasn't one overall encompassing project manager that was putting it together. So that was a challenge from our side that we needed to overcome as we were putting this together. How were we going to execute this? A bigger problem was the subtrades. The M&E subtrades, the major subtrades, were actually different companies on either site. There was mechanical contractor A on one site and mechanical contractor B on another site. So they had a whole different set of where the details come together, where the connection points are. Like something simple would be a toilet. What type of toilet they're using is different from one site to another. So your carrier's different. Your shaft requirements behind the toilet change. So that was a big impact on how we were putting this together as well. Our standardization of teams. So as I said at the start, we had originally planned these hospitals as 2 separate teams putting together 2 sets of contract documents. That all went out the window as soon as this requirement came. What we did is we learned from the past. That's a picture of Kelowna General Hospital. We had a project we had done probably 5 years earlier in Kelowna and Vernon in the interior of BC, which is basically the same thing. They were 2 hospitals, 2 quite large hospitals done, one in Kelowna, one in Vernon, under one P3 contract. And it was the same builder, so everyone was kind of building it off the past. That could have had a little bit to do with the reason why as well. Although those 2 hospitals were quite different from each other if you're familiar with them. Their facades aren't relatively nearly as close as the 2 are for Comox Valley or Campbell River. We had a realignment of the modeling teams. So instead of going from 2 teams doing 2 hospitals, we did a kind of 90-degree turn on how these teams go together. And so Team A was now doing, instead of just doing Comox Valley, they were doing exterior shell and detailing. And Team B, who was doing Campbell River, they're now doing interior fit out and clinical planning. So they kind of did a 90-degree turn on each other, and they split and they did both facilities. That way we could standardize our detailing and standardize our drawing practices between both drawings, which is what was one of the requirements they were requesting. So then that led our teams going from task-driven teams to task-driven teams from build-and-driven teams. So that was a complete overhaul, because then we had to reevaluate the skills of each member, who was good at what, who had the experience in what, because again, this is a P3 job and it's got to be out the door pretty fast. So the biggest one, before I get into it, is we're going to talk about referencing. We're just going to talk about plan detailing referencing, because there's a whole bunch of different types of referencing that we had to get through. How do we get two separate individual models together and reference them properly into one detail book, so that we're not tasking one individual person to go and back check everything and make sure the references came out and the back references came out properly? How do you put that together and go back to old school AutoCAD ways where you have to double check it instead of using Revit's intuition, and it's a job, one of those jobs we don't think about doing anymore because we don't really have to do it. How do you put it together? So we went through many, many, many different scenarios on this, and this is what we came up with. And after I present this, I'd like to get your ideas on it and what other thoughts you had. I could tell you if we'd gone through that or not. So what we did is we created a detail model, a third model, which is just holding the details. So it had both Campbell River and the Comox Valley referenced into it. Right? The main models are linked in. All the detailing annotations, detail components, everything was done within the detail model. And the sheets for the details all reside in the detail model. We use no link views, which is another way of doing this. We decided we didn't want to do linked views and push those through because they would be way too confusing and cumbersome in order to put those together. Right? So we had two buildings linked into, showing you how old I am. We had two buildings linked into one model. The referencing was done in those models to the details on referencing views. So we created a view, we created floor plans of each hospital in that model, which we referenced the details which were created. The only part of that model that was created live within the detail model was the details and the detail components. It was referenced. So by floor, we created a floor plan for each hospital in that model. Put true and sim references, so all the plan detailing references for every corner, every plan detail on the exterior that we would see in these buildings. We put that in the detail model. So how do you get that information back to the real living models? Again, we're not using linked views. So we did a CAD export. Workflow is the solution we ended up coming with. So the detail views, what we do from that point is we would isolate all the referencing by plan. We had them aligned with our current master models. So it would just, the only thing on that view is the detail bubbles themselves that you would see on a plan view. Export those into CAD, re-import those into the master Revit files, and those would be referencing the true Revit detail, or the true Revit details that resided in that detail model. So the trick to that one, it had to be the absolute last step prior to a plot. If it was done before, anything got moved, it was all out the window. So all we simply did is we plotted all of our details. They got plotted. That way we knew once that package was there complete, then you can go through, export the referencing, put it back in, because that detail package isn't changing. So it was a workflow thing and a real control point. There's a lot of working points, a lot of understanding, a lot of skill assessment with some of the people as we were putting this together, but it did work. The outcome of some of them were we aligned to were you able to align the details on both projects? So our IFC set, yes, they were, but through the evolution of construction, I would say 75% of them eventually split, and we had one for each project. We had an A and a B, just from certain site conditions, certain ways things got built, or whatever change orders or SIs came down through the evolution of construction. The standardization of the teams, that actually worked very well. The teams put it together. The original drawing package was very good. So that's something we would definitely be looking at in the past. If we didn't have to create the book, we would probably build our teams like that so we have an envelope team doing both projects. And the referencing, we keep reliving this one internally as to whether that was the right solution. We keep having discussions on, is there an easier way? I think there is easier ways, but you never really know that until you try to actually execute it. That's going to be the real time tested and true, is were you able to pull it off easier than you were before? But ultimately it did work for us, and it did solve our problem.
What was the reasoning for not using linked views from detail?
We didn't want to use linked views coming back because I guess you need to know a little bit more of the big picture. We didn't just have one main architectural model. We had two architectural models per building. We had a shell model and we had an interior fit-out model as well for each of those. So what we didn't want to do is really burden that by bringing a lot of the interior information into our detail model, because it wasn't required. I should have probably vetted that too, is the details were just for the exterior. The interior detailing, we did not do a detailing book because the interiors were different substantially enough from one another where you couldn't really use, besides industry standard details, which in a P3 environment you shouldn't be producing. Just those specialized things were specialized enough, it didn't matter. So we didn't want to use linked views going backwards, because you wouldn't actually get the whole story coming backwards. If you did, or you're talking going, which way do you want the linked views to go?
Creating your views in your detailed model.
Doing all the detailing in the master model and then linking them into?
Linking into the building models on the sheets.
Right.
Rather than doing the CAD export. So doing all of your details and actually creating the sheets and the views in the details model. And then linking that sheet view into your building model.
Right, okay. Well, the main reason for that one is not all the information lived in the detail model. All of our annotations, all of our dimensioning lived in our master model. We'd have to recreate that into our detail model, bring it back, and then annotate it through a link, which we felt that annotating the master model through a link was a lot more work and a lot more risk than it was going to be to annotate a detail through a link. Even though the detail wasn't a linked view, just the risk of something changing or something moving, especially through a link, would blow away dimensions, blow away tagging, blow away any of that intuition that we had built into it. So it was a risk reward kind of discussion, but yeah, it was, we decided no linked views. Going the other way, it was going to be way too cumbersome, way too burdensome, too many details going in one direction. We wouldn't be able to control it. No other questions? Okay, we'll move on to the next one. The doctor at F.H. Wigmore Regional Hospital. Right, this was a ILPD project we did, completed in the winter of 2015. It was done in Moose Jaw. You've probably all seen it. It's sitting on the highway. 21,000 square feet. First healthcare ILPD project in Canada, maybe the first one, maybe first non-healthcare one as well. We never were able to confirm that or not. We knew it was the first healthcare ILPD. If you're not aware, does everyone know what an IPD is? No? Integrated Project Delivery. So it's a process where you bring all the teams together, the owner, the builder, and the designer, they all come together under one contract. It's not individual contracts like you would see in your standard CCDC. Under one contract, all working towards the common goal. So what you would do as an architect is you would have the ability to be, as you're doing a design, say on the front curtain wall system of this hospital, you'd have the curtain wall subtrade right there working with you on those details. Basically building shop giving you shop drawing level information during your design. What it leads is to expediency in construction, less issues on site, and ultimately lower costs to the owner for getting the hospital or whatever building they're doing built. So we're not seeing so much of these in Saskatchewan as of yet. They're happening quite a bit in Ontario. They'll eventually, I'm guessing, eventually start coming this way a little bit more. It's, if you remember the news during this build, the whole, it gets tied into the whole lean perspective, which was in the news when this was getting built, of leading the healthcare system. So it kind of went away politically for a while.
I would find that whole process working with the contracting team, developing the details and everything as it's looking design.
I really liked it, actually.
Yeah.
It opens your eyes to a whole new world of, because we as designers or technologists, when we start putting details together, we don't think about some of the things that a contractor is going to think about. Yeah, everything fits, everything's nice and tight, but then the first question is, can I build that? How can I build that? It's like, well, how do you build it? And then once they explain it, it makes total sense. Oh, I can't detail it like that because you can't build it.
What kind of coordination method do you use between your drawing set and consulting with the contractors? Is it just a sit down with a paper plan, or is there a model coordination that happens between everybody?
Everything and anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'd have what we'd call the big room. It was in Moose Jaw. It was a warehouse that the owner procured, an old steel straight wall building where every week or every second week for 3 days, the entire design and build team would get together along with the owner group and go through whatever meetings we needed to have for that week, sit down, hammer everything out, go away for a week and a half, produce, come back, do it all over again. And that occurred for a series of about 2 years, up until they really started getting into the build and we realized we didn't need to have that level anymore once the building got to a point. So it's heavy, heavy, heavy collaborative effort, but it does pay off. So when I talk about the three, they call it the three-party agreement, the owner, the contractor, and the architect together under one contract. But they had what they called a core team. And that was 7 individual companies that were together that had a say in how the project would run. So when you're doing an IPD project, it's not just the owner saying, this is what I want, it's the whole team making those decisions. Because they'll do a cost comparison. This is what it's cost, this is what you can afford. How about we do it this way? It's a completely collaborative method. So there were 7 companies in that initial core team. And the modeling was completed. I was trying to count this the other day when I was putting it together. I believe it was 8 different cities, and we had 2 different countries where the models were residing. And key to this one, like BIM 360 didn't exist at this time. That would have been a perfect solution for this job. And Revit Server was still in its infancy for our internal sharing on how we got through this process.
So how did you share?
Oh, it was very difficult. It was like the architectural teams, there was 2 of them. There was us, who we were based out of Regina. We had our own Revit server system, which was fine enough for us, but the other architect was based out of Phoenix. So between them, we were responsible for the contract documents, and they were primarily responsible for the design. So it was initially planned as a handoff point. They'd get to a certain design's done, they'd hand it over to us, and we would do our working drawings. This being an IPD collaborative effort, design isn't done until it's built, basically. Everything's last moment as it's getting put together. So we didn't have that straight line handoff point that we wanted to. So while they were still doing design, we needed to develop working drawings. So that meant a bit of relocation to Phoenix, which for myself was in February, and I didn't mind too much for a couple weeks.
Do you carry the same subcontractors that during pre-construction, or do you guys have a tendering process after that to choose? Or?
For the core team, no. The major sub-trades were part of that core team, so they were already on board. Any sub-trades that were brought on there, if they were brought on to help with design assist or to inform a design, they were paid for their service if they weren't under contract already. They were paid for their time. And then they would, if it was going out to a public tender, which most of them did, then they would bid on that tender. And some were successful, some were not. Anything else? So a little bit more of the background on this. Because it was a major collaborative effort, we went through quite a bit of a learning curve on this one. There are some things we'd never tried before. There's some things we'd lightly tried before, some things we were good at. Like the 4D pricing, the contractor was using that quite a bit off the price. They were actually harvesting our model, taking what they can for the pricing. So we had to be, at this point, the model was more schematic. They wanted to get some baseline pricing in place, but even as it was schematic, it had to be as accurate as we could make it in order for them to be able to price it. The scheduling, we were producing the animated Navisworks style schedules where you build it into your Gantt and your P6 and you watch the building grow on your computer screen. We were putting some of those together. A lot of it was some of it was for internal use, some of it was for PR use, because it was the public was watching this facility quite a bit, so the owner wanted to be very proactive in showing this is what's happening. The level of clash detection on this, on an IPD, is at a level that we'd never attempted before. It's as detailed as I've ever done it. That was the biggest non-fun part of this project, because it was so detail orientated and everything. They wanted, the goal of the project was 0 issues on site. So by doing that, you're trying to clash, make sure everything gets fit in, everything gets put together. As soon as someone comes to site, installs something not as we had modeled, everything's out the window. So you're doing it all over again.
What did you use for clash detection?
Navisworks. That was our primary.
Did each consultant give a list of things they wanted clashed, or was there just one person overseeing and you clashed everything?
Yeah, so we had it was myself. I would manage the whole clash process. So I'd get their models in, we'd cut what we needed, we'd run the clash, and then we'd all just sit together in a room and start working them out.
Did you get any feedback from the contractor on the 4D pricing that they were using the model to get some pricing versus a typical way they go off the price of drawings?
No, at that point of the project, when they're actually harvesting, it was more to get it under the cost ceiling of the project. There's a cap, a maximum that project could cost. So it was a matter of getting that building down in size to a point before to get it under that cost cap in order for to get approvals to move to the next step of the project. So that's what it was used for. It wasn't used for detailed, this is what you're pricing. Although some of that information for the sub-consultants, if they were provided an opportunity to bid a job, some of that was provided to them for their use. Obviously disclaimed, use at your risk. So what I talk clash detection. So the full build team integration, that's the whole IPD philosophy. That's something we'd never done before. No one in Canada, healthcare-wise, as far as we knew, had done it before. And one of the other big requirements on this one, it was deemed a paperless site. They wanted no paper on site, which we're seeing more and more roll out, which is great, because people now have, they have current information on site.
How did you see the documents on site with being paperless? What were they using in the? So we've heard of paperless jobs before, and generally it comes out after the sort of paperless. So for true paperless, did they just have big drawing set screens and things in the trailers? What were they using actually in the buildings that the individuals putting up?
The majority, all the sub-trades, the foremen, they had an iPad, right? The drawings were always on there. They were uploaded. We had a way to upload those on a regular basis, or whenever a change order or an SI came out, so that when they went to the site trailer for lunch, they were connected to the Wi-Fi automatically. So at the beginning of the day, they had to go there and it would automatically download the latest set of drawings on their iPad, and they go for lunch, the same thing would happen. So they're only going to be 4 hours behind the latest issuance on site. The other thing they had is we actually uploaded, that was in BIM, when they started building, BIM 360 Field was just kind of rolling out a little bit. So we actually uploaded a model to that cloud, and they were able to use the model on site as well. When they were trying to understand some of our above ceiling installation and whatnot, that was also used. No negative feedback that I can recall. I might not have heard it. It might have stopped at the general and not got back to us about the actual guys on site, but it never changed. As far as I know, like from when I walked the site, you never see the big scaffolding laid out with a set of drawings or the work table or anything like that. You didn't see any of that. So it was one of the requirements of the project, though, is it would be paperless, because that was seen. Producing paper, producing sets of drawings is a cost. It's actually quite a substantial cost when you have to create 40 sets of drawings, and there was quite a few drawings put together with this project. It does add cost, and it also gives you another level to give to the site when you can produce in color. And if you're producing in color, producing hard drawings, your price of your drawings just gone up by about 8% or 8 times what they would for just black and white. But now you can give those color drawings to the site at relatively no cost.
How did the contractor do their as-bills on paperless?
There should have been no as-bills because everything was fully coordinated before it was installed.
So again, how did
As-bills were ultimately done red lines back to the design team. On paper. There was paper in the site trailer. There was contract sets. Right, so those did need to exist. We couldn't get around that to be 100% paperless. So, but when you left the trailer, you didn't see it.
So you guys would have been held to releasing drawing updates every week, or what was the requirement for that?
Because there was certain points in time because the build was happening during the design. When it got to those real tight points, yes. But after that, there was a simple IFC issuance, and then it was basically back to simple DB or P3 or IPD-CA, where it's just SIs. And once those get issued, there was never sketches issued. It was always full-size drawings for reissuance. If you moved one wall 2 feet over, doesn't matter. You're not creating a sketch and issuing that. You're issuing a full drawing. Put it up to the cloud, gets downloaded when the guys get to site, so when they see it. And it's clouded, so when they pop it up, they know. Especially if they're working in there that day, because chances are that's what's happening. They're working, they ask you the question, you change it, you send it out.
So are those clouds backtracked as well? So if I was looking, if you changed a detail, if I'm looking at the plan view, is it highlighted there too, so I can say, oh, that changed, and I'm notified to go look at a changed detail? Was it only the detail?
Sorry, you lost me.
So we have a software program that we use where it's actually like flipping through a set of drawings.
Mhm.
So you look at a floor plan, I can click on a detail, it takes me to that detail. I click on for that wall section, I click on the detail, it takes me to the detail, and then I can backtrack as well. So if you're saying that
You're talking like history versions of drawings.
no, like.
Oh, like hitting the back reference?
Automatically flipping back to the plan view of the.
Right.
paper drawing. So if you're changing only a detail and issuing a new page, is that detail that you changed also flagged or tagged on related drawings, or only that one page?
We would change, any drawing that's affected by a change would be changed and reissued as a part of it. I think what you're talking about is that Bluebeam system that seems to be going, where you can create those systems in Bluebeam and you can actually hit and they reference back and forth. Yeah, that wasn't out when we did this. It was, the system we used was PlanGrid, if anyone's aware of it. Autodesk just bought it, so you're probably going to be well more aware of it moving forward for all of you Autodesk users. But it holds all the drawings. They're live. You can go back historic versions. The new Autodesk version implements with the 360, so you can click on, look at 3D. It's amazing what they're coming out with.
For your clash detection, what were the software applications used in like the original design? Was Revit the only application used, or were there other products?
When we got to the Clash, it was just Revit and Navis.
So no 3D AutoCAD, nothing.
No, there was some 3D AutoCAD that came back from some of our design partners. For example, we as a consultant, Stantec Consulting, didn't do the sprinkler design. That was subbed out. And we generally don't do sprinkler designs. So they do all the work. One of the requirements when they were hired, you need to provide us with a 3D model. And that came back in AutoCAD 3D. But it was a very small part of it.
You mentioned that you met with the team regularly for your clash detections. How did those conversations go? Because in the past, I've done something similar. I ran the clash detections. I just gave them a report highlighting the major issues I saw. We would actually sit down and talk to them on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
So how did those conversations work out?
Well, for this job, it was a project requirement, so we had to do it. We knew we had to do it. It was just, and it might be simpler at Stantec because we're one entity, one team, one structure where this is what we have to do. We've done them not as involved on other, like some of those other P3s I was showing. We would have done clash detection on that, but I'll always run those. I won't just fix them and send them out. We'll usually run those reports, send them out, but we usually require a meeting in there, the way I work, so we can actually talk about them. Okay, because if you've got, well, structure is one thing. Structure is not moving, but when you have a cable tray going through a duct, who's moving? Right? When you just send it out to the team, says, okay, these are the clashes we have to fix, because you have to have the discussion. Okay, we got to move. Someone's got to move. Who's going to move? Who's critical? Who's not? So you move one. Oh, now that causes another issue down the road that you don't really see, and then you just kind of be spinning. Again, going back to the highly collaborative environment, the more collaborative you can be, the more successful your process is going to be, in my opinion.
So recognizing that this project was a couple of years ago, did you utilize any digitized workflow to help you traverse this? You found an issue, put in a solution?
Not digitized, I don't think.
So all manuals, just conversations, you would dictate the action and somebody would follow through with it.
Yeah, there's areas we knew we had problems where you would solve it. Like when the clash, it's trying to think of a good example. I can't really think of one.
Just wondering if you used any tools to help you through the process.
Like outside of just the basic visualization, like we didn't get too complicated into some of those other ones that are out there now. It was basically Navis.
And again, 2015, so I get it.
Yeah, like the Navisworks model, like part of our workflow, we would actually send that out to everybody, the whole project team. Even the owner was using Navisworks with the NWF files, downloading the free version of it. They couldn't do anything with it, but they could look around and do what they wanted. Everybody was using it. And that was the one platform that was, well, it was free to everybody. So that was a big driver on that as well.
You said that when you were issuing changes for SIs, you used the full sheet revision. So just make an example here. Let's say you have a SI1 and a wall has changed but hasn't been approved. And sometimes there's a hole, and then you go and issue SI2, and in your Revit, show that SI1 that hasn't been approved yet.
Mm-hmm.
And then another site's gonna go ahead and make that change without being officially approved. So how did you deal with that, or did you ever come across it?
We probably did. But because we were so collaborative, everybody knew of what changed. There was never any surprises going to site. Everybody knew what was changing before we even started changing anything, because the discussion happened as a team all the way around. So it could have happened, but people knew what was going enough. At least the supers knew what was going on, or the foreman knew what was going on enough to be able to, if someone had the question, he could head it off at that end.
Did any of your internal processes, like going through this project and learning what you did any of your internal processes change in your office because of this project? Like the way it was delivered, or the way you guys grew or detailed or modeled?
Well, let's get into
Oh.
reflected ceiling plans. Thank you for the segue. So this is something that it was kind of self-driven, but it was kind of project-driven as well, was reflected ceiling plans. So if anybody was involved with Revit years and years ago when it first came out, the idea of Revit was never to have an architectural model, a structural model, a mechanical model, all these different subtrade models. The original Revit was supposed to be everybody in one model working. That was the original concept, the original idea, so everybody be working in one environment. As we all know, that's not the case. There's countless reasons why it's not a good idea, but we tried it. In our reflected ceiling plan, so typically it's done in the main model by consultant. The architectural will hold the architectural elements. Electrical will put in ceilings, mechanical will put in their diffusers, and then you'll go through the painstaking process of moving everybody around. Then your IMIT stuff comes in and you do it all over again. And with this one, there was the added impact of the contractor being there on site saying, I need access to these tiles. You can't put that there, so do it all over again. So our idea was we were going to have one integrated reflected ceiling plan model. That's how we were going to get through this. Everybody's working in one model. That way, the electrical engineer can't turn off mechanical when they're placing their lights, even though lights should be going in first. It forces them to see everything and know everybody else is there before they start taking up some real estate. So, requirements and risks through here. The continuity of models. So this was something we had to, again, it was a risk-reward kind of situation. If electrical is going to put their lights in, how are they going to do their circuitry for those lights back to the main model? You can't do that through links. I don't know if you can do it nowadays. You couldn't back then for sure. With the mechanical system, we'll just get into these. With the mechanical system, the HVAC, you're not connecting your ductwork to the branch. Is that a big deal? Again, risk reward. The other big thing, the element ownership, right? You're going to be stepping on everybody's feet when you're in here. You're going to be touching something that someone's already touched. You're relinquishing. You're picking up the phone. You're sending instant messages to sync. So we ended up going and developing a step-by-step workflow. Okay, architect's going to go in. They're going to do their ceilings. They're going to do their bulkheads. They're going to finish. Okay, when they're done, next, the electrical, they're going to get priority for lights over diffusers. So they're going to come put their stuff in. Mechanical's going to come put their diffusers in. Then electrical IMIT comes back later. They put in all their systems, the nurse call, all of that stuff. So it's a step-by-step process. And if you know the way they build lean, it's a tax-style construction where tax-style it's kind of like a moving train where everybody to do a job, it's a car on that train. So it just keeps moving one after the other. So everybody takes their turn one after the other, in order to put this together. Right, so we had a separate reflected ceiling plan model.
How did mechanical, work that backwards, so they would have had a building HVAC model separate of
Correct,
shared ceiling?
correct.
So were they still using all of the live data that's inherent in the mechanical model? That often comes, like, so for airflow and ductwork, as an example.
Yeah.
Right now all the airflow is based in the ceiling model, which is the link model.
The ductwork is in the mechanical model. The diffuser is in the ceiling model.
Right, but then they're not connected.
They're not connected, no, they're not. And that was the risk reward. How much of that inherited data are you using? It's the same thing as the electrical and the circuitry. Are they actually using that? It's there, they have the ability to use it. And especially at this point in where we were with Revit, but quite frankly, the engineers didn't trust Revit to do their work for them. So they were doing it themselves anyway, is what our conclusion came to. They weren't using that inherited data. They are better at it nowadays, but at that point, they didn't have a level of trust with the software at that point in time. So it ended up being a relatively small issue. The other part of it was it was the unknown. It was something we had never tried before. Right? So we figured, let's give her a shot. So the outcome, the continuity models, it worked okay. There ended up being no issues going back to any of that work with the flow. The element ownership was a bit of an issue, especially when you got to some of those real finicky areas where you did have to go back and forth. It didn't eliminate any kind of coordination meetings. We still, like the operating rooms, we still had to sit down in a room and coordinate those because those get designed like a Swiss watch every time. major corridor intersections, stuff like that. We still had, it wasn't quick and easy. You still had to sit down and coordinate some of these issues. The unknown, going down a road we've never gone before. Ultimately, would we do it again? My guess is no. We would not do this one again. Quite frankly, some of that inherited data is a big part of it now that they are using it. We didn't find much reward based on doing it this way versus the other way we do things. We still had probably just as much level of coordination meetings to go through and try to figure these things out. But given the right project, given the right situation, we probably wouldn't dismiss it immediately. But we wouldn't go out of our way to try and do this again. Any questions on Moose Jaw? So we've already had this discussion, but we'll get into it. We'll talk about Swift Current long-term care facility. This is a P3 project, 19,000 square meters, completed spring 2018. I always like the rendering and the actuals. It actually ended up pretty close except for all the grass in the surrounding area. But it's a highly collaborative between the build and the design team. It was a P3. So the team was all in all together. And this is the discussion we've already had, is this one was deemed a true, again, a paperless site, including all the change documentation. This was done in a different way than Moose Jaw was done. This was done using BIM 360. So we used that environment for this one. This was our first dive into that. I believe it was a contractor request, and it was something that we did look at. So some of the requirements and risks all of a sudden that came from this is staff education, right? It's always that, can the tech who's been doing this job for 40 plus years, is he going to take to starting to do all his change documentation via an iPad on site, writing his change orders on an iPad and sending them out, where he likes to print it off, sign it by hand, scan it, doesn't even like scanning it, would prefer to fax it. Those kind of situations. Software, hardware requirements. iPads weren't something that were in our everyday arsenal. So then it's getting through, getting those purchased and making sure everybody has the tools they need to do their job. And when you have a big company like Stantec with security measures, it's not as easy as just going down to Staples and picking up a few of them. And then some workflow revisions again. That was another big thing that we had to really understand, especially those guys that have been doing things a certain way for the last countless number of years. So again, the education, the software, the technology. We ended up getting through those hurdles, getting people trained up. BIM 360, if you've used it, it's very intuitive. It's quite simple to use. I don't want to say it's not mistake prone. It can be if you use it wrong. But once you get going with it, most people don't want to go back, and that's what we were finding as well.
Who owned the BIM 360 project? Who was the one that housed it? Was it Stantec, the consultant?
Who owned the subscription you're talking, or?
Well, so in a BIM 360 project, one person is basically the administrator of the project, creates it all, right? And then ourselves are invited into it.
Right. I don't know the answer. I don't believe it was us. I'm pretty sure it was the contractor.
The contract.
And it wasn't the owner?
Yeah.
It wasn't the owner. I don't believe it was. I honestly don't know. I know it wasn't us.
So was the work done as a design team with BIM 360 as well, or was it put on to?
No, this is that was the change that we had to overcome on this project, was going from setting everything up to not be this to going this way. It was kind of a bit of a right turn.
So right from the beginning, it was the contractor owned the BIM 360 environment, and everybody else was probably.
I'm not 100% sure on the background. That's the way I believe it happened, but I can't say for sure. So changing our workflow, it changed the flow, obviously, of which we worked. The drawing issuances, the drawings all got put together, had to get mass issued up to the cloud. But we also knew it as it does, and the biggest benefit is up-to-date documentation on site. So this one, unless we want to talk more about paperless sites, we've kind of already talked about it quite a bit. We would definitely be doing this again. We're actually pretty much all of our projects moving forward are moving in this direction. At the time, it was something that was new to us and something we needed to really look at. But definitely, that's a redo or not a redo. It's a do again.
Have you guys done traditional tenant job tables?
No.
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 Would you?
It would take quite a bit of discussion, negotiation, probably, and the right contractor.
Well, that would be the kicker though, like, you don't really know the contractor.
No, I mean after the fact, because it would be a decision. We've seen it before where we get, as a consultant, get BIM requirements given to us from an owner for a design bid build project, of which they have a bunch of requirements for the owner, or sorry, for the contractor to do in order to execute that project, which gets very difficult in a design bid build project. I don't know how you would do it successfully, because how do you write that into a contract without adding an exorbitant amount of risk to the contractor who's bidding that in order to get them to do some of these things during a construction, during a design bid build job? I think it would be I don't know how you would do that.
You don't think you just write that in the front end specs?
Well, you do, but then the contractor's gonna have to put a price to that. And especially if they've never done it before, how are they going to be able to put a price to that accurately?
Do you see it being a cost increase?
Potentially, depending on what the deliverables are. Like, if at the end of the day, if you're looking at a standard design bid build job that you would typically do traditional, and then you're going to, well, I'm not talking just paperless, I'm talking a whole bunch of other things that get involved with it. But all of a sudden the owner needs, or the contractor needs to coordinate all their sub-trades to provide level 4 and 500 fabrication models back to the main model to all get integrated into an as-built to turn over to the owner. That's a whole bunch more work for them.
Oh, yeah, no, for sure. So I was just on the paperless side, not an as-built model, not the contractor in the model, strictly a paperless. So essentially you would issue a PDF set, you would mandate a BIM 360 or a field wire software used for construction.
We've never done it. I see that, like, our construction association is starting to do theirs paperless for a lot of their stuff. It's going that way. It's going to go that way, but we've never done it. I'm sure there's going to be some hiccups. That can be next year's presentation or maybe 2 years on how paperless with traditional works out. Has anyone done it? No? Yeah, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of want.
We're beginning where all of our LOD 400 plus or 350 plus are in one model being done by the subtrades, managed by the contractor, and then coordinator, and then that's where it has to go to red lines.
That's for the modeling, but not a true paperless.
Paperless, everything's done through Procore, and anything that's changed or updated is put on that site, and that's where it's managed.
100%.
Nothing is 100%. But that is our goal, is that we won't get any red line drawings. They'll be all done in the master model by the subtrades that have actually.
Then if you handed your model over at an IFC.
IFC, the model became the ownership of the contractor,
Yeah.
and they manage all.
So there's a straight handoff point. So it doesn't go back to the consultant.
So make any CA changes that we need to, but if there's a mechanical change, the mechanical subtrade makes those changes.
And what's their responsibility for keeping everything, so, yeah.
So what we did is our whole building was done in the unified model, everyone had one model at one time. When we did IFC, they were split off in federated funds.
What was the contractor's responsibility to keep, speaking from the mechanical side, keeping all of the elements connected, get all that data
what's the contract model you're under?
Design build.
Design build. I don't know if that's me doing that. Okay, we'll go to our last one here. If we got time, we just don't want to get into your lunch hour here. This is Royal Columbian Hospital Redevelopment Phase 1. It's done in New West, BC. This is a design build project, 75-bed mental health and addiction facility. You can see it links into the Royal Columbian Hospital itself. This one's still under construction, set for completion. I believe substantial contractually it needs to be done at the end of this year. So they're going a mile a minute out there right now trying to get this one wrapped up. For this one, during a DB or a P3 pursuit, it's not uncommon to be able, or to have one of the requirements to produce a 4D, an animation associated with that project, part of your cell, in order to put it in. It's usually a requirement. The owner will take that, use that, take it to their foundation, and they'll use it to start fundraising for the new hospital, saying this is the new hospital we're going to donate some money, and they use it as a tool, as well as developing renderings of that facility. So you can see some of the renderings we had developed for this during the pursuit phase of the project. Where this one was different, that we'd never experienced this before, and it kind of caught us off guard, is that we had a requirement to give them an updated animation model and renderings at the IFC phase of the project. So if you've been associated with a P3 or a DB bid before, when you submit your drawings for that bid, they're generally, and I would say this is high, they're at a 30% completion. Right? They're nowhere near IFC because there's a whole bunch of things that happen between winning that job and actually building it or starting to build that job. So some of the risks that we hit, the physical building design changed from bid to build, right? So our animation, it was no longer relevant. It was close, it was very close, but it wasn't relevant. And we were contractually obligated to provide them a new one. We had to go through these ones, some of these renderings and our major animation, we usually farm that out, we sub that out, we don't do it ourselves. There's people that specialize in that work and they're a lot better, quicker than we are in producing that. So we had to revisit that whole step again. Do we do it externally or do we do it internally now? And then the other one was cost. That was a big driver on this, as it is with most things, cost, but we won't talk much about that. We'll get through it. So to update the physical design layouts from bid to build, so like I said, the documents go from 30% up to IFC level. There's quite a bit of change. And a lot of that has to do with the user consultation process. If you're doing a P3 pursuit, you're designing the facility out of a book. You're not talking to the people working there, understanding how they work, where things move, where things change. As well, there could be mistakes in their documentation, errors or misinterpretations that you don't get to until you're actually building that. No, that's not what we wanted. This is what we meant. And then you understand it. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Designs change. You come to the conclusion some things aren't achievable. They've asked for something, but it contradicts the building code. We can't actually legally build this for you. Those kind of things come up. So the design changes. The external versus internal discussion. If it was an external, it would basically be a redo. They don't work in Revit. They take an export of WeDo. We'll usually export them in IFC, whatever software platform they decide to work with. They'll take it, import it, add all the finishes to it, add the rendering to it, the patterns, all of that information, throw it on there, create their animation, send it back to us. It's quite a bit of, it's essentially a reskin of our model. And then they add all the site and everything around it. Software usage. We had to look internally, what do we have that we could pull this off with? Do we have the ability in-house to redo this rendering? And we have this model. We have a full IFC model. Can we leverage this model? What can we use it for? So the outcome. What we did on this one, we did it internally, actually. And the way we did this, what we didn't want to do was burden our master models. That was the last thing we wanted to do, and that was a big play in this. As soon as we start adding finishing and rendering and surfaces to our model, it's going to get heavy and it's going to get slow. And this was sitting on Revit Server at the time, and Revit Server wasn't treating us well. It was already slow. So we did something very similar to what we did in North Island hospitals, is we created a rendering model, linked our masters into that, and this started applying surfaces in that rendering model where they were. Simple things like paint colors and that, we could put into our master. But what we wouldn't put in is like the wood grains, the reveals, all that got modeled into our rendering model of what we created. When we do any of these big jobs, when we do furniture, like going back to some of those original slides where you'll see where I had the desk, the 3D versus 2D, I'll always put my furniture and equipment in. I'll put it in, it'll be a cube because we'll know the size. I'll make a 3-dimensional cube. That'll be my furniture. I'll put a 2D surface on top of it. That way I know what it holds. That way it's light. That way I can reuse it. If we need to do a rendering or a view, we can swap it out with nice looking stuff down the road and then swap it back depending on how we want to do it. So all of those 3D elements that we needed to put in, we had to put those into our rendering model, again, to keep our master light. So you can see the difference here. We did notice there was a downfall a little bit in the quality in some places, but to get to the point of not quite photorealistic, it didn't need to be photorealistic. We did achieve it, I believe. The owner accepted it. So that's what's critical to us. You can see, can you guess which is which? Is that the external or is that the internal? That is. Yeah, that's the original.
What did you use for the rendering?
We used, for the rendering, we used mainly, it was Enscape with some Photoshop touch-up. Enscape, if you don't know what it is, it's basically a video game platform that Revit plugs into, and it gives you, well, whatever you put into it, you can get out of it. It does some pretty nice work. The site stuff was all done externally, not external to Stantec, but externally from the model rendering export. But you can see the changes, like those strip windows got changed out through the design process into standard windows. You can see the whole entry moved from the middle of the plaza all the way to the left into the corner. So things did change. Some of our nursing stations, bid versus build. You can see the difference. This one, it changed quite dramatically, but because it's a mental health facility, we had a 2,000 pound rating on all of the 2,000 foot-pound rating for force on all of our glass going into these. So having the nice light framing that we sold them in the design wasn't a realism down the road. We needed the full curtain wall framing system tied into the slab below and above in order to resist that. Those kind of issues. So that was something new for us. It was a change, but ultimately with the help of some of the 3D people we have internally and some bright students, we were able to pull that one off quite seamlessly, actually.
So what was the owner's requirement for having like updated like images and such? Like was that for marketing purposes?
Most of it is driven by their foundation. They'll want something up to date because that's what they go out and they do their fundraising with. Because looking at besides having the building actually coming out of the ground, which is a lot more real, and it's just a strategy they use in order to help procure the money they want from the local communities. But this first time we needed to update it. So I'm wondering if it's going to come out again or not. I'm not sure. Okay, so I just wanted to touch back before we wrap up here on some of those learning objectives we were talking about. We kind of grazed a lot of the, or all of them, during some of the presentations. So, like looking at the first one, don't plan your project to a level where you can't change it. If you can't change it, you're eventually going to hit a brick wall. Don't let that software drive the product. Like I said before, implement your out-of-the-box thinking. Start looking around for solutions. Use the internet. There's lots. Chances are if you've hit a problem, someone else has hit that problem too. Start searching around, see what you can find. Collaboration, discussion, phone calls, emails, instant messages. Always be talking. I've had a lot of these projects, I've had the privilege to work with a lot of the same team for my consultants, the model managers. There's a group of 4 or 5 of us, and we do all these large P3 projects together. And we know each other, we've worked with each other for years, we know how each other work. So it's getting pretty seamless. So we don't need as much communication as we would. If I work with a brand new independent team, it gets dialed back to step 1 until you realize what that team can do, put them together. And it's communicate, communicate, communicate. And with the collaboration as well, don't use other people's experience, right? Listen to what other people have done. Maybe someone else has hit that problem before. Don't rule your model saying this is the way it's going to be. We've worked for those model managers before that say this is the way it's got to be because that's the way I want it done. That doesn't work to a collaborative environment. And again, keep your change manageable. Don't overcommit. Like an example of that is our ceiling plan. So we tried to change that. We did it with just the ceiling plan. We didn't try to make one big model with everything in it or portions of a model. It was just the ceiling plan. Small changes, see if it goes. If it's successful, go a little bit further next time.